The University of Minnesota Twin Cities respectfully acknowledges that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. The University of Minnesota is founded as a land-grant institution, and we recognize that our founding came at a dire cost to the Dakota people. The Dakota were forced to cede their lands in return for goods and services, but the government did not uphold the terms of these treaties, leading to widespread devastation. We recognize this painful past, and we honor Dakota people's history on this land. We honor their sovereignty, and we honor their continued contributions to our region. Minnesota comes from the Dakota name for the region, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the skies. The Dakota and numerous other indigenous peoples whose cultural, spiritual, and economic practices are intrinsically woven to this landscape, hold this land sacred. We recognize them as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it, who had a thriving and vibrant community here prior to disruption by settlers. Today, the state of Minnesota shares geography with 11 tribal nations. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and hold the University of Minnesota accountable to recognize and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to impact Indigenous people through mutually beneficial partnerships, through research, through policies, and through practices that respect indigeneity. Hello, I'm Ann Waltner. I am chair of the history department, and I would like to welcome you to, I don't know, this is probably the 20th iteration of the History Book Club. I got emails from a couple of you wondering if there was some kind of error because didn't we have Caley, Horan, and Ben Wiggins already? And the answer to that question is yes, we did, but the roles were reversed. Caley was the commentator on Ben's book, and now Ben is going to be kind of the interlocutor for Caley's book. So what we're doing today is we are discussing Caley's book, Insurance Era, Risk Governance and the Privatization of Security in Post-War America. Caley, I didn't actually write down what year you got your PhD. It was some time ago. You're now teaching at MIT. Ben is not a history PhD, although we take a very expansive view of who is ours. He got an American Studies PhD, and he's kind of deepened his connections with us. He's now the Digital Humanities Librarian. He's an affiliate with the History Department, and he teaches courses in digital humanities, and he taught a course this fall, I believe, on the archives. So his PhD isn't from us, but he's deeply, deeply involved with us. And so I think without further ado, I will turn the floor over to them. We will do as we normally do. There will be 30-35 minutes of conversation between the two of them, and then we'll open up the floor and you can ask them questions, whatever you like. So thank you very much. And I believe, Caley, you're going to talk briefly about the book, and then you'll go into conversation.
Yes, that's right. I will talk very briefly about the book because I'm really looking forward to Q&A and actually hearing from Ben. So I do have some images. I hope to kind of structure our whole conversation around a series of images. And so I'll share my slide here. Can you see that all right? Good. All right. So let's see here. Let's go back. So Insurance Era, well, actually, first, I suppose I should probably thank everyone. Thank you so much, Anne, Clayton, and especially Ben for all your work to make this happen. And thanks to everyone who's shown up tonight. It's really nice to see all of these faces of folks, of my Minnesota folks, and then it's really fun to be back in a reverse role with Ben. So Insurance Era is really about the private insurance industry in the United States and the many ways that it shaped American life during the second half of the 20th century. So what I want to offer before we kind of dig into some images is just a few words about the book organization. So the book is organized kind of thematically and also chronologically, and it has really three sections. The first section is called Selling Self-Made Security, and it looks at marketing and public service initiatives that were launched by the insurance industry in the United States. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what insurance marketing looked like in the wake of the New Deal, which is really when I kind of pick up the story, and also what insurance companies were up to with a real bevy of public service initiatives that they launched really beginning in the early 20th century, but kind of picked up speed with that during the post-war years. The second section of the book is called Investing in Privatization. And there I kind of follow the money and look at what insurance companies in the United States were doing with their pretty substantial amount of capital. They were actually, the insurance industry was in control of the largest base of private capital in the United States during the post-war years. And so that section really has two chapters. One looks at insurance investments in urban housing, right immediately following World War II and a little bit before World War II as well. And then another chapter looks at suburban financing and the kind of unexpectedly large role that the insurance industry played in shaping the suburbs. And then the last section of the book is titled Defending Discrimination. And it really examines the efforts of the insurance industry to combat activism on the part of civil rights and feminist activists, and to especially combat their critique of industry underwriting and risk rating practices. So that's a really brief kind of overview of the contents of the book. But what I'd really like to do is kind of dig into it a little bit. And I think what we'll be doing, Ben, is I'll be sharing some images, and then you can kind of you can talk about them a bit, and maybe we can kind of collaborate on a conversation about them.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And thanks everyone for welcoming me back, and thanks Caley for letting me return the favor too. The book is great, and it was such a pleasure to read. I loved it because it seemed like a book that I knew I was going to love it. I could read anything about insurance, and especially you know, your scholarship is fantastic. But it also seemed like a book that could finally communicate to a really broad audience just why they should care at this industry that just has such a reputation for being boring and just, I mean, mind-numbing almost, right? And people don't think about insurance. They don't want to think about insurance. They think it's not interesting at all. And I think you made it so interesting, and you showed so much of its influence across the 20th century, and it's just really nice to see you know, really the importance brought out there, and so that was fantastic. The images along the way are great. We'll get to my favorite in just a second, but the first one here, it's from the Institute of Life Insurance, and you point out in the book that they're kind of a part of a decades-long effort to combat federal regulation and state-sponsored insurance. Can you tell us a little bit more about ILI and how it functioned for the industry? I mean, maybe the only thing more boring than an insurance company is an insurance company association, but you make it so interesting. And I want to know more about them, and kind of who they were targeting in these ads, and how effective these campaigns were.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for your nice words about the book too. Right, okay, so this particular image is from the Institute of Life Insurance, which was really one of the first public relations organizations that was founded in the United States. That was a corporate public relations organization. And it was founded really just a few years after passage of the Social Security Act, specifically to combat and contain the expansion of the welfare state. So insurance companies in the insurance industry, and particularly life insurers, were very threatened by the kind of growing American welfare state, and mostly because they were concerned about nationalization of their industry, or regulation of their industry, or just what executives called in like trade publications and speeches the growing trend towards statism. Right. And so what they did to combat the growing welfare state was really launch into marketing and public relations. And so this particular image, the only real security is self-made. There's a bunch of these that the Institute starts putting out in the late 40s and early 50s that kind of depict private insurance consumption as a source of autonomy, a source of freedom, and often at the same time depict public forms of insurance or public services as a form of dependency. And so that rhetoric actually really begins during this early post-war period and is disseminated by organizations like the ILI.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it seems like they had such an influence and really unexpected. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things you don't exactly even know what these kinds of organizations have done, because they fly under the radar, but here you're showing them interacting with the public in a really important way. Let's move on to the next one. There's so many of them. I want to get to all of them.
All right. So this is another Institute of Life Insurance advertisement. This one is from I think a couple years later. Ben, did you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, this is the one that I think you talked about, like its strategy for kind of promoting individualism, right? And so I just would love to know a little bit more about how they centered on this strategy for taking this collectivist product and putting individualism really at the center there.
Right. So you can see, I think there's a kind of similar message to the ad that I just showed all of you. This one has a few different twists. On one hand, it's actually an image of workers building various kinds of projects, and you can't really read the copy, but a lot of it kind of talks about the many kinds of infrastructural projects that the life insurance industry took part in. So like factories and pipelines and new housing, and it's creating jobs. And so there's a way in which the industry is really depicting itself as a kind of like nation builder that acted in ways very similar to the state. And there's also, one of the reasons I like this ad so much is that it has this kind of added anti-state messaging at the end. Through life insurance, you're building security for yourself and your family on your own. And you're not depending on somebody else to do it for you. And make no mistake, the somebody else is absolutely the government, right? And so you see this kind of messaging really in insurance advertising produced by the ILI, but produced by other like individual companies as well, really throughout the post-war years. Shall we move on?
Let's go to the next one. Yeah.
All right. So the second chapter of the book really looks at public service initiatives. And so I've selected two images. The second is Ben's favorite, and he can't wait till we get there. But this particular one is from Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. And it's a part of a pretty substantial public health program that launched in the early 20th century and that really continued well into the post-war years.
Yeah,
Ben?
this is such an interesting image. I a couple times in the book, you talk about I think that kind of Nicholas Rose quote of like life itself, like insurance companies are really dealing in matters of life and death, and it's so intimate. And I just would love to hear more about how you can kind of talk about the way that insurance companies come to shape how we view ourselves and how we treat our bodies, and that really intimate relationship we have with the rhetoric of insurance, or at least the rhetoric of risk.
Actually, before you do that, could you talk us through a little bit about what's on this image? Because I can barely see it. I mean, it's tiny.
Yeah. So basically, very provocative title, checked your weight lately. It's part of this new focus in the sphere of public health, but particularly public health initiatives led by life insurers to focus on kind of new sources of illness, like relatively new sources of illness during the post-war years. And so there was a lot of attention to weight. There was attention to stress. There's a lot of public health materials that Metropolitan in particular distributed that dealt with how to manage stress, which was a part of a new kind of health category. But this one in particular, I like because well, first of all, you have these wonderful charts where readers of the ad are kind of expected to find themselves in the chart and figure out which category that they fall under, and to alter their behaviors in such a way that they'll fit into the ideal weight for their height and build. This is also reflecting changes in the field of actuarial science, where actuaries were kind of constantly refining different categories. And so for a long time, build wasn't considered in terms of the appropriate weight that a person should be. And so there, what I like here is that there's an element of governing going on, and an encouragement to consumers, to readers of materials like this, to kind of think about governing their own health. And of course, we're living in a moment when public health is crucially important, and I think it's hard to look at efforts like any kind of public health efforts and not feel pretty good about them. But one of the and I do think that Metropolitan's health campaigns were incredibly they did incredibly good things in a lot of ways. But I think there's also a really interesting a process in which Americans are being asked to check their weight regularly, to monitor themselves, to kind of pay attention to different aspects of their own health, mental health. And that's a kind of a new development during this period. Does that help, Anne?
I muted again. The answer is yes, it helped a lot.
Excellent, excellent. So there are other public service initiatives. It's not just public health. There's a lot of fire safety and home safety, pretty much any kind of area that insurance companies and insurance leaders saw as affecting the insurability of their clients became an area for intervention, right? And so the idea wasn't just to make people healthier, it was to make them less costly to the insurance industry, so they would make there would be less claims because people would be healthier. So it's a kind of population management strategy. So another public service initiative that I find particularly fascinating, this is from property casualty insurance field rather than life insurance, is driver education. So it's kind of a little known fact that insurance companies were very, very active in the field of driver education during the post-war years. And do you want to jump in on basically this is the Aetna Drivo trainer. I love images of the Drivo trainer. There might be some folks here who might have learned to drive on the Drivo trainer. They were installed in schools around the country in the 1950s and 1960s. And so if you're of a certain vintage, you might have encountered a Drivo trainer in your high school classroom. Go ahead, Ben.
No, this is great. I mean, this is my favorite, and it's one of the things that is really extraordinary in that. Well, first off, I love that you kind of in the book tackles so many different lines of insurance. It's hard to do. I mean, they're very specialized industries in some ways, or specialized parts of companies, but I think you really weave together all of the different lines and their influence. And with the Drivo trainer, I mean, well, first off, there's somebody who's written like a history of video games that has totally forgotten about this and gotten it wrong, because this is probably more influential in that than we ever thought about. But I mean, it's interesting to make the connection between driver education and insurance. But what I think makes that more interesting is thinking about the insurance industry's relationship to education and how we teach and why we teach certain things. And there's just such an important, story here in all of the things you're talking about, and self-governance and ideas of how we care for ourselves. And I'd just love you to talk any more about the relationship between the Drivo trainer and just how we learn that insurance is really working on how we as a society educate our citizens. It's incredibly important.
Right. So with the public health, with the driver's education, a lot of it is about training or encouraging, giving people the tools to manage their own risks and to be reflexive and self-conscious about risk. And so, I mean, there's a zillion things that are interesting about Drivo trainers. I mean, first of all, just to give you a little bit more background, you can kind of see these little devices that the students are sitting in, and behind them in this image, you can see a projector. And basically it would project a film in front of them that was a kind of lifelike a roadway. And Aetna, the company who created this, actually had a whole like in-house like film division that would make these films, and the students would learn how to drive using these films. So, I mean, the simulator aspect of it is really interesting. The fact that this is something that the company successfully had installed in public schools, which is there's a bunch of other educational materials that private insurers were able to get into public schools, just tons of textbooks and other kinds of curriculum. But they were on their way to making them kind of required in schools across the country, in public high schools, and that project faltered for a variety of reasons. But one reason why I think that's such an interesting project is because these devices actually gathered data from the students as they were learning to drive. And so you can't see it. You can find these film strips that are really wonderful where they record the whole process. There's these like Scantron styles printouts that kind of score the students as they're learning to drive. And then what Aetna did was it took that data and it used it to to set rates for graduates of the program, but also to gather data about young drivers, which were thought of as a kind of particularly problematic group of drivers to the auto insurance industry, and they wanted to gather as much data as possible. And so there was this moment where they were almost using public schools across the country, but I mean, there were tons of them anyway, but they almost had this moment where they had this like place where they could sell their insurance to young students, they could gather data. It's really, really interesting. Ben, we could talk about the Drivo trainer all day, but maybe maybe we should move on. You and I can just have a chat about Drivo trainers. I will say just one more thing, that these are precursors to the telematic devices that are actually really gaining in popularity today. There's like the Allstate Safe Driver. There's a variety of these. You plug them into your car and it gathers data about your driving behavior. It sends it to your insurance company and you get a premium discount, right? Well, insurance companies sell that data to third parties. They admit to doing so. And it's a larger process of kind of this voluntary surrender of data about ourselves. But maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. There's a whole nother part of the book to talk about, lots of fun images. Maybe we can go really light on the urban housing. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah. I mean, I think just the thing I'm really interested in here is like the amount of control that insurance companies desire, and they're not just building these, they're managing them. That just fascinates me. I don't know if you had any particular reaction to learning about that history, where they're so deeply involved in creating the existence of their investment.
Right. So just a quick summary here. During the years around World War II, there was massive housing shortage in the United States. As I mentioned, insurance companies were sitting on this like huge, these huge quantities of capital, and so basically city and state governments and large insurance companies made these deals where the insurance companies would be legally permitted to invest in housing, but also commercial real estate, but mostly housing, in order to solve this housing crisis. And so cities basically gave insurance companies huge swaths of land. They gave them tax breaks to build these massive housing developments in cities around the country. Most people, well, a lot of people are probably most familiar with Stuyvesant Town in New York. If you're in New York and you're anywhere near it, it's hard to miss. Here's an aerial view of it. But Lake Meadows is another one of these massive insurance housing developments built in Chicago by New York Life Insurance Company. There's a really short period when these things are being built by large life insurance companies, really from the early to mid 40s into like 1952 is just like the cutoff. They just stopped building them. But they're really interesting to me in the sense that these are spaces that are you can kind of see from the aerial view that are like strictly ordered and tightly controlled. And I think I was interested in the ability of insurance companies to shape the built environment. And of course, one of the things that's really important to know about some of these urban housing developments is that a large majority of them were racially segregated and designed for really for white middle-class Americans. And so there was a whites only policy that Metropolitan, for example, had in their housing developments that attracted criticism. But yes, they're really interesting developments, and I think probably one of my favorite chapters to write in this book, because the tenant, the ways that the insurance companies controlled their tenants. So they didn't just finance these places; they built them, they managed them. So your landlord was an insurance company that was very interested in controlling risk, controlling tenants, making sure people behaved in certain kinds of ways, segregating, classifying. It's just, can you imagine having an insurance company for a landlord? I think it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Shall we move on? Or Ben, do you want to?
No. And they were fairly profitable, it sounds like, too. And it sounds like their control really had an impact on making sure that they always got a return on their investment, which.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about urban renewal during this period, and I mean, often the blame for this production of racial segregation in cities is often laid on the government, right? But one of the big arguments I make in the book is that we need to also look critically at private industry and the ways that private industry also shaped racial residential segregation. And yes, these were profitable for a time, but there was a lot of bad press associated with the whites only policies. And so eventually tenants actually also were very pesky. They kept organizing and trying to fight the insurance companies. And eventually just the task of managing these huge properties with so many people in them became too difficult. And so insurers really pulled out of urban housing. And what did they do next? Urban housing was not really it was too difficult in lots of ways, and actually it wasn't really as profitable as they had hoped in the end. And so right around the early 50s, around 52, 53, what you see is insurance company investment wings starting to like pull money out of urban spaces, and just there's this really prolific period of building in the suburbs. And so one argument I make in that section of the book is that the insurance industry played this massive but often like completely ignored role in financing suburbanization. So this is Short Hills Mall in Milburn, New Jersey, which was a Prudential project. Prudential was a particularly prolific financer of suburban shopping malls. And this is a postcard, but it looks pretty nice, right? But one of the things that I found in my research was that insurance companies financed nearly every single shopping mall built in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, which is something that I hadn't really encountered in the scholarship that I'd read on like the mallification. So for me, it was important to talk about how insurers as financiers actually shaped these kinds of places and the landscape of consumption in the post-war years.
You do a great job with following the money, as you say, and I think it's in the suburban chapters in particular, it's just really interesting to see just how much money they're well, you don't like, I mean, you kind of play with the metaphor of the pump here, and just kind of how much they're really channeling the suburbanization of the United States. They're just moving their money. They have to keep their money, there for the policyholders is their excuse, but they do it in such particular structured ways, in such ways that had a really lasting impact on our built landscape.
So if anyone's interested in shopping malls, we could talk about it after when we have our conversation, and particularly why it mattered that insurance companies were financing them, like what were the impacts of that. But let's go on to another aspect of insurance kind of subsidizing, financing, shaping suburbanization. I probably need to write more about workplaces, because part of the book looks at suburban corporate campuses built by insurance companies for their own use, suburban corporate campus headquarters, but also suburban facilities that were used by other industries beyond insurance. So this is Connecticut General Insurance Headquarters in Bloomfield, Connecticut. And this building that you're looking at was like just massively influential. It was one of the very first corporations to make that move from the city to the suburbs. And I mean, it was beautiful. Like the descriptions of this place are, people just kind of lost their minds over this new suburban campus. And it was, now these things are everywhere, but this was like really one of the very first, and particularly one of the very first that was dedicated to white collar labor.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this, and if you want to go on to the other ones too, just in the interest of time,
Yeah.
I'm just really interested in these chapters on, or this chapter on kind of these, the actual headquarters of insurance companies. And as they move out to the suburbs, they really kind of, in some ways, suburbanize some classical functions of work. Like there's Fordism and Taylorism in there. But there's also, and there's even like elements of like company towns where they have everything, and you can shop at the company store and everything. But there's also, they're breaking away from things too, and they're trying to redefine work in important ways too. So I'm just wondering,
Sure.
what do you see reflected, and what do you see them really innovating on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So these are kind of images from the same Connecticut General Headquarters. I mean, it's a very idyllic kind of setting. They have these expansive lawns and parks and these cafeterias. And so they, when companies made the move to the suburbs, they kind of packed their facilities with amenities that were designed to kind of draw workers from the cities, but also to there's a lot of discussion about how when you offer things like dress shops and bowling alleys and hair salons in the workplace, that people come earlier and they stay later. And there's a lot of discussion about worker management and how to kind of use these idyllic settings to extract more from workers. And it's always important to remember that the majority of insurance company workers during this era were young women who worked basically as calculators, as computers in clerical jobs. And so I could talk all day about worker management strategy in insurance companies, but the interior, so this is the American Republic Insurance Company in Des Moines, which really followed in the lead of Connecticut General. It's kind of outside of downtown Des Moines, and picked up a lot of the design elements that you can see in the Connecticut General facility. And so a picture like this gives you a kind of glance at what the insides of these buildings looked like. And there's a few things that I would point your attention to. First of all, there's this very innovative open floor design. Where there's, you can kind of see in the very back that there's a partition. It's a wall that's actually movable. It's called the CG partition, and it's a precursor to the cubicle. I know people sometimes think that I think insurance was the root of everything, but they did. They invented cubicles. I mean, it's ridiculous. And there's also this particular ceiling design where you have air conditioning and lighting up in the ceiling, which allows for these open floor designs. And so this is really good if you have a lot of paperwork and you need to kind of have a white collar factory, like a paperwork factory, which is what a lot of people called these things. But it's also very good for surveilling your employees if you want to kind of be watching what they're doing all the time. And so there's a lot of discussion about surveillance. Another thing about these kind of architectural innovations is that it meant that there wasn't a need for windows. And so this is kind of where we start seeing this idea of an office, which is secluded, it's sort of blocked off. And I guess just to sort of conclude my conversation about insurance workers and new forms of worker control developed by insurance companies during this period, one thing that really struck me was that insurance executives talk quite a bit about suburban locations as useful for avoiding unionization and labor activism, because what you have are employees that are segregated from workers in other industries and in other companies. And so you have these zones where you have just certain kinds of workers, and they're not having these kinds of interactions that they would have had with other kinds of workers in the city when they go to lunch or when they meet up with other folks. I could talk forever about, I want to write about workplaces. It's just so fascinating. More workplaces for me, I think. So, okay, Ben, shall we move on really quickly?
Yeah, let's get this last one.
We'll just throw this one out there. This is from the last section of the book, which, as I noted, is about the insurance industry's defense of discrimination. And they actually use the term discrimination. They own the term discrimination. This particular advertisement was produced by Aetna as a way to counter the efforts of feminists to pass legislation that would make insurance unisex was the term they used, but basically men and women would pay the same for various insurance coverage. The women's movement basically picked up this battle against the insurance industry almost immediately after the ERA failed to pass. And many in the women's movement really identified insurance as one of the kind of behind the scene actors that prevented passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, because it would be costly for the industry to change its underwriting. The fear was that the Equal Rights Amendment would force insurers basically to provide equal rates and equal benefits to women and men. And so the women's movement kind of jumps on that in the early 1980s, and they are met by an incredible assault on the part of the insurance company to prevent legislation that would make insurance unisex. There's a lot of lobbying that's going on, but there's also ads like this one. Insurance companies would send letters to all of their female consumers and tell them how horrible laws, unisex laws would be for them and how much more they would pay. And I don't know if it's possible for you to really see it might be a little bit too small, the text in this ad, which basically repeatedly returns to this idea of fairness. So it's like, that's not fair. This is equally unfair. And so one thing that I was really interested in when I was looking at materials for this part of the book was the way that insurance companies responded to feminist arguments about equality with their own argument about fairness. And so they actually end up, the industry ends up really settling on this concept, actuarial fairness, as a kind of competing vision of the social good that competed with social equality. And so you have feminists saying equality, and the insurance company returns with fairness, right? And so I'd be happy to talk more about what how insurance companies define this concept of actuarial fairness. But I do think ads like this are really particularly fascinating, especially when we think about the question of why our insurance system has been so difficult, why it's been so difficult to reform it, and to really to regulate it, and to change the way that we receive insurance in the United States, and this balance between public and private insurance. Sometimes, people make cultural arguments like Americans are just individualists, but I do think that the efforts of this very powerful industry to need to be taken into account when we ask questions about why reform is so difficult in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think your book makes such a nice arc from those first images where the insurance company is trying to, the insurance company organization, whatever ILI is kind of trying to take this idea from, individualism, anti-state, anti-socialization of insurance, or socializing of insurance. And then it moves to this really evolved rhetoric of actuarial fairness, which I think is such an interesting concept that you've zeroed in on in the book. And kind of, it's the concept of actuarial fairness, which you show is coming out of the industry itself, is really a major turning point in kind of modernizing that rhetoric and getting us to where we are today, to the point where it's going to be quite a battle to reform the industry, and it has resisted.
I have hope.
For a long time. Yeah.
And also, I mean, this is a great opportunity to go full circle, because when we started out, Ben, you mentioned that a lot of people think insurance is boring. What we're looking at here is an advertisement with footnotes. Right. And I think those footnotes are there to serve a purpose, right? Which is this idea that insurance is so boring, so technical, that we should really look away and we shouldn't pay attention, that it's too difficult to understand. And so we should leave it to the experts and the people who know about it. That feminists and civil rights activists who were challenging these corporations were often accused by the industry of not understanding their subject matter, when in fact they understood it quite well, right? And so there's a way in which this this idea that it's too technical or that it's very boring is actually a strategic move. And so hopefully I've made it a little bit more interesting for people. I do hope that folks who are interested in reforming our insurance system will find their way to my book, or at least, I don't know, that people who read it will think a little bit more critically about the rhetoric that the industry has used for decades now, to really, I think, keep security out of reach for people who need it most. And wrap.
Thank you both very much. We have a couple of questions, and we have time for more questions than we have at the moment. One of the questions is going to return to the Drivo trainer. Robert Bloom is interested in the fact that the people in the seat are women. And is that a commentary on the need to educate women as drivers, or is it, I mean, how do you interpret that?
Yeah, so this is not actually an advertisement. This is a photograph that was taken for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, kind of offering, that was sort of advertising this new cool simulator, not advertising, but it was like showing it. And so this wasn't actually produced by the image itself was not produced by the insurance industry, but both female and male students learned to drive on the Drivo trainer. But insurance companies are actually much more concerned about male drivers under 25 because statistics showed that they were more likely to get into accidents. I mean, it's similar. We have similar rhetoric now. So there was a lot of efforts to do psychological testing on young men to kind of weed out the bad eggs. And so this one conglomerate of auto insurers, the Kemper companies, they distributed these psychological tests, like thousands and thousands of them, and young men who kind of scored poorly, they had to pay more for their insurance premiums. I mean, it's a really fascinating. When you really dig into the kinds of information and the kinds of data that insurance companies use to price risk and to create these categories, it becomes very obvious very quickly. And Ben, you know something about this, that they're very subjective and that they're pretty much just like throwing darts. They're trying to figure out ways to sort the population and to figure out who should pay more. And so, of course, women were charged less than men because during this period they drove cars less frequently as a group, right? But this is always a question about group versus individual. And that tension is so fascinating in insurance. And it's something that I think we could all stand to think a little bit more about.
I think that you're coming close now to talking about a topic that you said you'd be willing to talk about more. And that's the concept of actuarial fairness as opposed to equality. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Actuarial fairness is a concept that I think is it's an ideological concept that is invented by the insurance industry. It's been picked up by other industries since the post-war years. Essentially, it is the idea that good risks, which is an industry term, should not be made to subsidize bad risks, also an industry term. So it's the idea that there's a kind of fundamental fairness in whatever kind of risk rating you've been given, that it would be unfair in some way for the people who have, let's say, a perfect driving record to have to subsidize people who have a imperfect driving record, or that women, for example, because they, as a group, live longer than men, should pay the same amount for their premiums on life insurance that men do. The insurance industry said that that is unfair. Whereas feminist and women's activists would say that it's sex discrimination in its most blatant form to charge women and men different rates and different prices simply because they are women or men. And so there's these really fascinating debates between the statistics wielding insurers and the equality championing women's activists, where they get into these debates about how many years exactly do women live longer than men, and maybe there's just a small group of women that live longer than other women, and should we really be forcing women as a group, or should we really be treating women as a group? Maybe these statistics that the insurance industry have been gathering, maybe they're really old and they haven't taken into account the fact that women's lives were changing during this period. And so you actually get feminists saying that that women are dying, or eventually, because we're reaching social equality and economic equality, that women will die younger and younger, just like men, and that there'll be an equal. So I mean, the debates about the statistics are great, but yeah. So the actuarial fairness argument, I really do think, is a strategic and ideological claim that that's very it's become very embedded right now. And one of the things I tried to do in the chapter where I really dig into that is to show its historical emergence, and to show kind of the context and the conflicts in which that concept really became important for the industry.
Thank you. Kirsten Fisher wonders whether you make a connection between the move of insurance campuses to the suburbs and to white flight.
Hi, Kirsten. Thanks for the question. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, one of the big arguments in the section of the book that deals with the built environment is that the insurance industry was really one of the major drivers of urban disinvestment because it was pulling jobs and tax revenue out of cities. And I haven't talked much about another section of the book, but I just don't have any good images for it. So I didn't talk about it, where I deal with insurance redlining. And so at the same time that insurance companies are pulling tons of capital out of cities, they're also redlining. They're making insurance very difficult to access, or charging very high rates for people that are living in urban centers. And so there's actually researched after the urban uprisings of the late 60s, mid to late 60s. There's governments trying to figure out how to get how to recover, how to help these cities recover. And what they find is that the urban crisis itself may have been caused by lack of insurance in cities, right? That there were the condition known as blight, which is a pretty loaded term, but it was used constantly during the late 60s and early 70s, may have actually been created by lack of availability of insurance in urban centers. So it's a kind of double whammy in the part of the industry when it comes to what's going on with cities and suburbs. So they're pouring money into the suburbs, they're taking jobs, and then they're disinvesting in cities and pretty while also redlining and preventing people from having access to vital insurance products. Is that sort of, yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you so much, Caley.
Yeah, thank you. Kate Kimball says, from what you describe, it sounds as if some of the insurers' power came from their large amount of capital. How did they generate that? So the Depression was 10 to 15 years earlier. So it seems as if the wealth was generated quickly, which suggests very high profit margins and perhaps no regulation.
Excellent question. It's actually regulation that allowed the insurance industry to weather the Great Depression. So there were some really big scandals. The Armstrong hearings of the early 20th century, something, a lot of insurance historians that deal with the late 19th, early 20th century have to talk about Armstrong. Basically, there was a lot of concern that insurers were participating in speculative behaviors. And so regulations were passed that in the early, around 1905 or so, in the early 20th century, that basically forbid insurance companies from investing their capital, which comes from premiums from consumers. They were forbidden to invest their capital in anything unrelated to the practice of insurance. And so they could basically build office buildings, which they did, but very little else. They could have some mortgages and these kinds of things, but they weren't allowed to invest in real estate, which was seen as speculative, and they weren't allowed to invest in stocks. And so what happens in the 1930s during the Great Depression is that the insurance industry loses very little. In fact, actually kind of gains property and gains income when people default on their life insurance policies, when people lose their properties that insurers held mortgages on. So the insurance industry actually does really well during the Great Depression, unlike banks. And it was regulation that allowed insurers to kind of come out of the Great Depression with all of this money. But there's a legal story here as well, because they were not allowed to invest that money in income generating properties until they got the laws changed, which is an interesting story as well. That there's constantly, I wish I had more evidence about insurance lobbying. I found more than I anticipated, but insurance lobbying is really fascinating to me. Does that help with that question?
I think it does. I'm going to ask you now a huge question without very much time to answer it. You mentioned reforming the insurance industry. Can you expand a bit? You seem not entirely pessimistic about possibilities to reform the insurance industry. Can you talk just a bit about that?
Sure. There's a few reasons I think to be optimistic, but I guess I can say a couple more things about insurance regulation. Unlike other financial institutions, the insurance industry is regulated by the states, not the federal government. And so there are a kind of patchwork of laws from state to state that regulate insurance. And there are organizations that kind of stitch those laws together, but they're mostly run by insurance representatives themselves. And one of the things that the state-based regulatory system does is it allows states to kind of compete against each other to pass laws that are favored by the industry. And so you can see instances throughout the post-war era when a state passed a law that the industry didn't like, they picked up and they moved to another state, and it happened all the time. And so there's a way in which the state-based regulatory structures actually serves the industry in a lot of ways, and there's been plenty of attempts. I think the most recent one was 2017 to abolish that system, which is the act, McCarran-Ferguson Act, is from 1945, but insurance regulation, very complicated because of its state-based nature. But I guess my point would be that there are a lot of people who are interested in federally regulating the insurance industry. One thing that would do would mean that people who are attempting to make reforms on a national level would not have to do so on a state-by-state basis, which is something that civil rights activists and feminists came up against during the 60s and 70s and 80s. But so that's, I mean, there's interest. There's more interest now in abolishing McCarran-Ferguson and changing the regulatory structure, which I think would actually be very useful for creating some kinds of reform. But I also think right now, I mean, if you look at polling, there are far more Americans who are interested in, say, universal healthcare programs offered by the government, more people who are interested in that in particular, Medicare for all. There's talk constantly these days about abolishing private health insurance. And I think that that's different. I mean, that's new. The number, particularly of young people who are calling for these kinds of new programs, government programs, is very exciting for me in the sense that there's not a lot of that, there's more of that sentiment now than there has been since the 1940s. And so that gives me hope. I think the kind of precarity that people live under, the exposure to risk, the fact that so many young people can't get health insurance, that you know, that there's a new generation that's interested in changing how insurance is structured in the United States, and how there's a new group of people who believe that like healthcare is a human right. There's more attention to racial discrimination in auto and in homeowners insurance, and so you know, there's a lot of work now that when I started the dissertation that turned into the book, there wasn't a lot of work on redlining. I couldn't find anything on redlining. There was like one book. Now there's a ton of books on redlining and the FHA and its role in, you know, segregating America. And what I want now is to see more attention paid to private industry, and more people looking at private industry as a source of inequality and a source of discrimination. But yes, I feel mildly hopeful right now when it comes to changing American opinions about insurance and its role in our lives.
Well, thank you. You've done a couple of things, and in addition to talking about your wonderful book, you have in fact shown us that insurance is not boring. As Kirsten Fisher said, it's sort of deliberately obfuscating, and you've given us some chance for hope. So thank you very much, and thank you, Ben, for being such a good interlocutor. We will meet again on April 17th, and the book that we will be talking about is David Morton's Age of Concrete, Housing and the Shape of Aspiration in the Capital of Mozambique. Elliot Powell will be from the University of Minnesota Morris, who's also one of our graduates, will be his conversation partner. We have a couple of tentative things lined up for summer. In the middle of July, Chris Lane will be talking about his book on Potosi, and Carla Phillips will be talking to him. When I was talking to him, I said, who do you want to be your interlocutor? And he said, you know who I'd really want more than anyone else in the world? Carla Phillips. And Carla said yes. So anyway, we'll keep in track. You've got a lot of emails in the comment, you've got a lot of chats in the chat, and there may be some questions you'll want to respond to later. I think that tomorrow or soon, everyone who signed up will be getting an email from Clayton. There will be a link to the recording of this. And if you are in a position to donate to the history department so we can further this kind of great work, there will be information there as to how you can do that. I would like to thank everyone for coming, and I would like especially to thank Caley and Ben for doing such a great job, such an interesting job. It's all so interesting and complicated. So thank you very much.